Hello, and welcome back. This is the Latinaxe Lit podcast. The Latinaxe Lit podcast focuses on Latina, Latinx, and Latina writers and how their work aids in the movement of social justice. Today's episode, hosted by Dr. Jackie Cuevas, features Ire'ne Lara Silva. Miss Sliva is a poet and storyteller. Her writing focuses upon her life experiences, which is lyrically done in her latest poetry collection. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Latinaxe Lit podcast.
So welcome to our show. Thank you so much. We're honored that you agreed to be our guest. I'm super excited. I've been following your work, as you know, for a long time. We've worked together in various kinds of ways. I've seen you read. I've seen the progression of your career. I'm a big fan, I will say, and always excited about what you put out into the world. You have just such important work, and you move through different genres, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. So will you tell us who you are and a little bit about how the ways that you identify?
So everybody thinks that I was born in the Rio Grande Valley. But even though I have the Rio Grande Valley accent, and even though I'm homesick for orange groves and palm trees in South Padre Island, I actually was born in Turkey, Texas, in this tiny little town close to Childress, close to Lubbock, that area, because my parents were working in, what were they doing at the time? Cottonseed. Cottonseed was the big harvest at that time. So I actually grew up there, and I spent a lot of time in my childhood, as the daughter of migrant, truck workers, truck drivers, all over Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. I've been in Austin now for 23 years. Wow. So I've been in Austin for 23 years now. So apparently half my life I've lived now here in Austin, which I think makes me, be qualified now to be considered an Austinite. So I identify as many different things. I guess probably the best would be an indigenous identified Chicana, Tejana. I'm open to, Latina, Latinx, all these different, I'm all for more inclusion. So it's all good. I have no argument with Latinx. I'm fine with Chicanx. I'm fine. All of those, they're all good. Queer, disabled, chronically ill, non-academic, governmental worker, Austinite. So all of these different things kind of are part of who I am.
Can we talk a little bit more about where you grew up and how that landscape and the place moves with you in your writing? What role does where you come from play in your work for you?
Part of it is that I grew up seeing a lot of different things. I remember that I was really taken aback. So I went to college in upstate New York. And it was really interesting to me, as it was already an experience of, intense cultural clash and generational strangeness and all kinds of, class differentiation and everything. But it was interesting. One of the things that was really interesting to me was to see other people from the Rio Grande Valley go to college in upstate New York, because I realized that they had lived their entire childhoods in the Valley. So they were used to seeing, brown teachers, brown sheriffs, brown policemen, brown border patrol people, brown principals, brown city councilmen, brown senators. They hadn't seen that, they hadn't been exposed to the kinds of things that I had been exposed to, because I had spent time in West Texas and Oklahoma and in many other places where there was no attention paid to these gradations that people in South Texas felt. That there was Mexicans born in Mexico, Mexicans born in the US, Mexicans that were brought over, Mexicans that were lighter skin shade or darker skin shade, that were working class or that worked in an office or that were professionals. In some of the places, including Turkey, Texas, where I was born, it was just you were a Mexican. And if you were Mexican, you were a wetback. I remember I got into a fight with this kid from a farm. I was in third grade, and I don't know why, but it was only the two of us in the classroom. And he called me a wetback, and I was so angry that I threw a desk at him. I kind of shoved it at him, and he was so ashamed that, basically this 8-9-year-old girl had thrown this desk at him, that he didn't, report me to the teachers or anything like that. We just fought it out amongst ourselves, and then I tackled him, I think, when we were playing football later. But anyway, it was that kind of exposure to different prejudices and different understandings of what Mexican was, as well as being, poor working class out in the fields, in an agricultural role. It was very different how I had experienced peoples of other cultures or the dominant society than what people in the Rio Grande Valley had experienced. I think in some ways it wasn't just that my mother was more indigenous identified. I think there was something about the fact that we lived so close to the land, that we were always intensely aware of the seasons, that we were intensely aware of the crop cycles, of the sun, of weather, of all the way these things were related to, very directly to work, to what our daily lives look like, to whether or not there was going to be food on the table. And even now, I mean, I end up saying this all the time, so many people don't know what vegetables or fruit from the field taste like when it's come directly from the vine, from the branch. And that's a very different relationship to food than people who, always expect it to be available, who have had food shipped from very far away, who don't know what ripe things are. In fact, that's one of the interesting things that I'm experiencing now with the pandemic. I've taken to pretty much getting everything delivered, including my groceries. I cannot get anyone to pick produce the way I would have picked it if I was in the store. I had some incredibly orange tomatoes and some really green bananas. And I'm like, I feel like I have all this fruit and vegetables at home that are waiting to ripen before I can eat them, because that's not what I would have chosen if I'd been in the store. And then, of course, my brother, who, Master Chef wise, for him, he's even at a complete other level of what food should be like and what produce should be like. So that's part of it. And then I think I was also extremely influenced by the fact that both of my parents were illiterate, both English and Spanish, because they grew up in South Texas and around the Corpus Christi area in the 40s. My dad was born in 37, my mother in 1940. There was no push to have brown kids go to school. I mean, there pretty much was no truancy policy for them. I remember my mother telling me, it was LULAC organizing that got them into the schools. But by then, of course, it was much later. And so they only had a first and second grade education. So I grew up in a home with no books. I have 5 older siblings. And I think maybe only one of them liked to read, but she was much older than I was. So, we mostly grew up in a house without books. My parents mostly spoke Spanish. So all of that affected my relationship to language and the way that I felt about it. And I fell in love, I think, with the alphabet on the first day of kindergarten. I remember that except for the elemental P part of the alphabet, that I learned it all before I got home. It was elemental P was like one letter, and then the rest of the alphabet. I fell in love with the library right away. I thought it was the most wonderful place for years, and I think I still do. I still love libraries. And then also there was the fact that we were constantly moving. We never lived anywhere for more than 2 or 3 months. So it made it necessary to learn how to carry what I loved with me. And so I think maybe that's why writing and reading became so important, because there were things I could carry with me. And I think even though, like I said, I've now been in Austin for 23 years, I still have the idea that that my art and that my stories are things I can carry with me. I don't need very much. Give me a piece of paper, give me a pen, give me a little time to just daydream, and I can make stories. And I don't need a lot of things or a lot of space. I know a lot of people believe in having, a writing space and a dedicated time and dedicated rituals. But I think because of my childhood, I tend to think those things are not necessary, or that they can become confining instead of becoming encouraging if we feel that we always have to have that. I'm always surprised that chaos and difficult times in life, instead of sometimes keeping me from writing, they actually push me towards it. I think I was still not completely recovered from COVID when I started writing my last story. Part of me was so glad that I survived it, and part of me, I think even in the sickest, on the sickest days, I would still have a couple seconds or a couple minutes of thinking about the story that I had thought of right before I got sick. And so it's the first thing I did as soon as I started to get well. I was still having trouble reaching for words and having trouble with vocabulary and still dealing with extreme fatigue and everything else when I started writing again. And I was so happy to write that story. I was just so happy to be making story again. But yes, so getting back to what I was saying. So yeah, I think there's something about carrying stories with you. How mobile they are. I know a lot of people have timelines and outlines and things like that. I don't really believe in them because I think stories will take whatever amount of time they will take. I like the fact that even when you're not writing, in some ways, you're still creating. there's still a part of you that's investing in that, or that's manifesting, or there's ways that your experiences are feeding into what you're going to create. It's the big composting place of taking all of that. So yeah, lots of different ways.
Speaking of the traumas that we've all faced recently that have disproportionately impacted different kinds of folks, do you want to talk about your recent experience of the Texas storm that just happened?
Yeah, let's go with the most recent trauma first.
Yeah.
So I've had water now again for, let me see, 1, 2, 3. This is my 5th day with water. So yeah, we went 10 days without running water. 2 of those were also without power. And of course, those were the 2 days that the temperature went down to 6 degrees, which is, I think, unprecedented for Austin, or at least in my experience of it. So yeah, so those were really rough. And then on top of that, so as a caregiver for my brother, we couldn't really get away to a hotel or somewhere else since he's in a wheelchair, can't transfer to a vehicle. And yeah, I mean, here at home, we have everything, all of his accommodations and basic needs met. And if I were to have tried to take him somewhere else, I would have had to take all of those things with me, or it would have been a risky thing to have him transferred to a bed and then have to keep him there until it was time to go, and then risky to get him out of there again. So we stayed here. There were some days of being iced in and being cold, and my poor brother, who's very picky with his food, having to have applesauce and Doritos for breakfast, which for 2 diabetics is probably not the best the best meals. But we made it through. I think there was just one day that I was feeling really bad because I was just like, you get to those moments where you're just so exhausted, and it's like, okay, we're going through this now. We just barely recovered from COVID, and that was a rough recovery. And then that's in the middle of this whole pandemic, and then all the issues with the pandemic. And that's that I'm, one of the fortunate. I think they said there's only about 16% of Latinos that are able to work from home. So I've only been working one day in the office a week, and I've been very fortunate being able to work from home. But it has changed a lot of things, especially as a writer and performer and speaker. I was devastated last March. In the space of 2 hours, I had everything canceled that I had planned for that spring. And then, on top of that, just all the challenges we were facing before that, both of us being diabetic and trying to deal with health challenges and financial challenges and, ongoing exhaustion of working a full-time job and caregiving and trying to write and trying to do the reading and the speaking and some editing and consulting and organizing or coordinating literary events on top of that. Fortunately we made it through COVID and no hospital runs, and my brother didn't get as sick as I did. I was talking to a friend of mine about that. When you think of 500,000 people gone in less than a year, I mean, that is, and how much grief there is out there now, how many, just everyone trying to comprehend the scope of that, trying to still stay, optimistic and healthy. And then I think, on top of all the challenges that we were facing, well, all of us as creative people, but I think especially, for queer, BIPOC people to be trying to still create during the Trump years. And then it's like, here you go, here's a pandemic, keep on trying to create then too. But I don't know, I do think that, for those of us that can, we absolutely have to continue creating and trying to reach out to friends, to other people who create, and just bolstering each other and supporting each other through these times, because even in difficult times, there's still an opportunity to appreciate life and the gifts we're given and to give to each other. I mean, there's a lot of poetry I've read, a lot of stories I've read, a ton of music and movies that have comforted and inspired and energized me in the last year. Well, always, but I think especially in the last year.
Who have you been reading?
Right now, a lot of poetry. I've been reading so much poetry. I was telling you, I was one of the judges for the Texas Institute of Letters, and then I'm judging 2 other poetry competitions in the next few weeks. So more poetry is coming my way. What else have I been reading? I'm trying to think. No, right now I think it's just been a lot of poetry and a few collections that I've just really loved. I shouldn't mention this title or the poet because they haven't been told yet that they won anything, but I just want to, but I love the collection so much that I was telling the other committee members, I just want to call this person up, like right after it's announced, and tell them that I need to be their friend and that I'm going to come up and visit them and that we're going to go for a drive and talk poetry. And I'm going to invite myself to their home so they can make me dinner so we can talk some more about poetry. Because I love this collection so much. And I'm just like, that's it. This person needs to be my friend, which is, I think, an interesting way to think that that's how I react now to work that I love. Instead of just being in awe, I'm just like, that's it. I just need to call this person up and be like, that's it. We're friends now. You don't know me, but we're friends now. And we're going to hang out because this is awesome and this is wonderful. And we need to be friends.
What kind of writing came first for you in your journey toward writing?
The first thing was writing stories. So this is kind of a story I've told other times, but it's the beginning story. I was taking a nap, or rather, my older sister, who was trying to watch her soap opera, had told us all to take a nap. So we were taking a nap, and I had this really intense nightmare that all my family had died in the fire, that I was an orphan. I got adopted by a family. I was barely starting to be comfortable with that family and with my new school and with my new everything. When I then got abducted by aliens who decided to take me to their planet, where I was going to have to participate in some sort of gladiator challenge to see if I could earn my way back to the Earth. And so at the end of the dream, and I still remember this, at the end of the dream, I'm in the spaceship and I'm looking out and all I see is space. And I see Earth getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then I just woke up completely terrified of fires and aliens. And there was no one to go to. My sister would not have cared less. My two brothers were asleep. My parents were working. We were out in some isolated, farm town area because we were harvesting God knows what, probably silage at the time. And so there was no one to go to. There was no one to call. There was nothing. So I don't know why, but I decided to write down the nightmare. And there was no paper in the house except for brown grocery paper, the brown paper bags from the grocery store. And so I found a pen and just wrote out the whole story on the paper bag. And for some reason that, even when I was 8, it was such a consolation to be able to write it down and to have it on paper. And I think that's where it started. I think I remember that I first started writing nightmares and my own versions of fairy tales. And that was probably, I think, the first 2 little notebooks that I filled up. And I don't know where I picked up the idea that revision was necessary, but I ended up revising them and rewriting them and polishing them and putting them into little paper notebooks and things like that. So that was around 8. Poetry probably came around 10. And that was mostly playing, just sort of playing with words and playing with lines. I don't think I wrote anything I really meant. Well, I probably started to mean things around 13 or 14, but I don't think I came anywhere near finding like my own voice or my own subject matter until probably right before I went to college. So right my senior year in high school. And probably the last 3 years of high school, I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote throughout lunches, after schools, at night. I don't think I slept between maybe age 12 and somewhere in my 20s. I just didn't sleep. So all that time I spent reading or I spent writing. I remember when we were working in Guyman, Oklahoma, and a couple other places, sometimes we'd end up living in a motel room instead of a house or an apartment. And so my parents would be asleep, my brothers would be asleep, and I'd put a towel underneath the bathroom door. And I would just sit on the toilet and, with my notebooks on the little sink counter and just write and write and write and write while they were all sleeping. So there was a lot of writing then. And then college was a combination of poetry and stories. Essays I came to write completely against my will. That was like in the last, maybe not even 10 years, less than 10 years. But I kept getting asked to write an essay about this, or write an essay about that, or do a paper for this conference or whatever else. And I was completely against the whole thing. And I don't think I willingly wrote one until, of my own free will, I wrote an essay last year. So all the years before that was against my will. But what I have found to be true about essays is the same thing that I found to be true about poetry and fiction. And that's that they serve very important functions. They let me explore very different things in different ways. Poetry for a long time was to explore personal experience and my own emotions, and where I was in life and what I thought about things. So that for me has always been poetry. It's only, I think, in the last collection where I started to have some sort of mythological, sort of exploratory kind of pieces that I really hadn't had before. With fiction is two things. I think they're maps, especially with my first collection. A lot of it was trying to figure out the problem of how you survive and how you go from a place of surviving to a place of transforming, enduring, and living a full life, more than just surviving, more than just basic surviving. So it's a map for that. It's a solution it's possible solutions of a problem. So it's different ways to look at it from different angles. It's sort of, they're experiments caught in language. I think what I'm finding with essays is almost that they are like a capturing of an internal argument. All of these things that I've never completely articulated to myself. It's a way to do it in a way that I think perhaps in poetry I would skip too much of the process. Poetry would insist on the language and on the image. With an essay, the logic and the reason and the description has to be completely fleshed out. And so I'm finding essays a very good place to do that, and also to juxtapose different things in order to figure out what the value of that is. I just recently had my second essay article story for Texas Highways magazine come out. And I'm still surprised that they accepted the pitch, because I wouldn't have thought that a travel magazine would be interested in my list of wildflowers that I would want planted at my gravesite, mixed in with all these musings about death and loss and cemeteries and funerals and things like that. I'm still extremely surprised that even happened. But it was a place to think about those things that wouldn't have worked anywhere else. And although I've not finished the first novel yet, I think it came to me maybe about a year or two ago that a novel will allow something that the other genres haven't. Because looking at, in the same way that, a poem can be an entire world, a story can be an entire world, but it's usually a snippet or a flash of it. But a novel is this whole immersion. One of the projects that my imagination, I think, is caught up in is this idea of the dangers of writing too much of the world the way it is instead of the way that it could be. Because if we continue to insist that only borders and only oppression and only violence and only hopelessness and only powerlessness can exist for us, then in some ways I think we're doomed to give power to that over and over again. We are recreating it every time we speak it and tell the story. So, this is perhaps something that we haven't seen a lot of generally in literature. They're not something that people look for, but especially I think it's a problem when we look at Latinx or Chicanx literature, is that where do we see the language and the stories and the potential that have the potential for transformation? Not just in terms of language or imagination, but in terms of inspiring that in the people who read the work. I always go back to Toni Cade Bambara, but I'm badly paraphrasing, but I think the famous quote is that that the function of literature is to make revolution irresistible. There's that idea of how, and it's an abstract sort of thing, but this idea of how do we make imagination revolutionary? How do we not only demonstrate it, how do we model it? How do we find the language that will help us show how you imagine and envision and manifest a different world? Not just in some far off future, not in not in a science fiction sort of post-apocalyptic kind of way, but even in our day-to-day lives. How do we create that now? I always think of revision, maybe because I always saw my mother making quilts, and she would build, layer by layer. She would build the panels for one side, build the panels for the other side, put in the filling, the cotton filling, put those, put the layers, and then, create the borders, do the sewing that would bind it all together. And so in some ways, when I think of revision and a fiction, I think, or of all revision, but in a way, it's like unmaking the seams, undoing the seams so that you can make something new. So I have this feeling of this idea that a novel, in a way, would be a way to undo the seams of the world or of life as we see it, and then create something new. And sometimes maybe not even to create something new, to create the space for something new, to create an opening that wasn't there before. This is something that I think I do see more in Indigenous literature, in Native American literature. I know Leslie Marmon Soko for me has always been a huge influence for prose. For poetry, I love Joy Harjo and Linda Hogan, Deborah Miranda, who we both know from Macondo. In the last few years, I've become very violent towards books, and I keep wanting to throw certain books at the wall, or out the window, or throw them at other people. I don't know, because I keep finding these books they're beautifully written. They're beautifully written. They're popular. They sell well. They win awards. But I feel like as I'm reading them, I feel like they are reinforcing voicelessness and powerlessness and hopelessness. I had a very long argument with somebody over the fact that, yes, I understand that for some people, that's what they know. They know powerlessness and they know hopelessness. But why is that all we ask for in our work, in the literature that we're reading? Why would we want more of that? And then it makes me despair to think that as a community, that Latinx readers wouldn't ask for more, wouldn't ask for other. To recognize ourselves is not enough, especially if we are again and again recognizing ourselves in literature that portrays us as powerless and voiceless and hopeless. What else is there? That's one of the issues I think that I'm wrestling with in my work. And that's not to say that a lot of my work, doesn't also include, violence and different kinds of abuse and different kinds of historical trauma. But not, I think, just to be interesting, but trying to look at how do we live with these things? How do we see these things? How do we live with these histories? And how do we even begin to attempt to imagine how we heal or make ourselves whole? Or, like I said, even begin to imagine a break from those things. How do we let the light into this?
Good question. Beautifully said, too. Thank you. I appreciate what you're saying. It's a really good point, something to think about. I feel like I want to go reassess some things that I've read recently to kind of see where they would fall in that spectrum. How do you think about, I think social justice is kind of, a big container and sometimes a kind of confining container, but just sort of broadly speaking, thinking about the work that you see your writing doing in the world, do you see social justice as part of that work? Or how do you kind of think about the kind of work or cultural work that you see your work offering readers?
I got asked a very interesting question almost a couple of years ago, about a couple of years ago, at a writers' conference, one that I'd never been to before. And I was invited to be on a panel. I want to say that it was about 2 years later now. I think that it was about creating characters, different, characters, lively characters, that kind of thing. And someone at the very end, an older white man, asked me about a book that he was working on, and that he wanted to make sure that it had a social justice aspect to it. And so, how would I advise him to go about including that in his novel? And I think what I told him is also kind of the answer to this question. And what I told him was, social justice has to be the container. The parts of your book that relate to any matter, whether it's race or injustice, violence or oppression or poverty, whatever issues it is that you want to contain, it's not that you're containing them, that's your container. What stories do we choose to tell? From what point of view do we choose to tell them? I talk a lot about, in different workshops, about strategic choices. Why do you start where you start? Why this narrator? Why this time? Why this tense? All these things impact what you're building. And so if you want to talk about, let's say, access to healthcare, that is your container. That is your plot. That's what drives your characters. That's what motivates what's going to happen. That's what affects everything. It isn't the sprinkling that you add to it afterwards. That's the entire everything. So that's your container. That's your vehicle. That's whatever way you want to frame it. That's its primary place. Part of how I look at whatever it is I'm working on. I don't think that it's ever really possible for me to look at any story or any poem or any essay without thinking of it from all these different points of intersection. How am I seeing this, as a queer person, as a brown person, as a person that came from this, as a person that is exposed to that, as a person who feels deeply about this. All of that is always shaping where the story is going, who the people I write about are, what I want to tell, what I hope to inspire my readers with. Also, the thing with poetry is that when I started writing and really finding my voice and performing it, I was in college, and it wasn't at cafes or at bookstores. I started reading during protests and during cultural community things, that kind of atmosphere. And so it made me think very differently, I think, sometimes about what work is, because it was never separated for me from its impact on community or the opportunity to inspire others or energize others, or even myself. I sometimes am surprised, I think, that I chose writing as my centered place to be an activist, to try to affect some form of change or imagination. I always thought it would be something else. I thought I would, be involved with either endless protesting and marching, or that I would be, working with nonprofits, or that I'd be doing other things. I didn't suspect for a very long time that the place that I would choose to center all of that would be in the writing. But I think that is the choice I made. That is where I've chosen to center and collect and magnify from that place as a writer. In many ways, that can feel sort of futile, or it can feel like it's not happening. But, I've been fortunate in the last 5 or 6 years to do, well, until recently, a lot of traveling, a lot of visits with students and classes, a lot of meeting with different community centers and different people, and to see some of the conversations that are happening, to see some of the stories that are shared, to see that the imagination of individuals and the imagination of a community is something that can be affected through work. And so I feel hopeful in that, and I feel in some ways more empowered and more powerful in writing now, to know that people will sit with my work. Hopefully it will inspire a few, that these things that we think don't do very much in the world, that they actually do have a force and an energy and a presence in the world. That's a fortunate and transformative thing to understand and to feel as a writer. I was telling somebody recently, I feel like it's only been maybe the last 2 years that I have stopped fighting myself in order to get to the page. And so now all the energy that I used to spend fighting myself to make myself write can now all go to the writing. It's amazing to be at this point. And so I'm just curious to see what's going to happen next.
How did that transformation happen?
One of the few ways I think that I can articulate it, there was a workshop, it was a weekend workshop, a retreat that I did with some writers, and we were talking about the internal critic, the internal editor. And it was interesting because one of the participants said the internal enemy. And there was something that was just so, it made everything clear. The fact that it's not necessarily a critic or an editor, but that there is depending on the person's going to be a different thing. For me, I think it was a voice of self-destruction. It very much took form as my father's voice. And I think my father, as a frustrated artist himself, became a person who wanted to destroy creativity in other people, especially in his children. And so it wasn't just someone criticizing me or saying, this is worthless, but an actual self-destructive, want to explode everything. There is no point to creating, destroy yourself and everything around you and other people as well, kind of impulse. And that was, I think, huge. And then I was talking to a poet friend of mine, Leslie Contreras-Schwartz, and we were talking about, she was saying, have you ever spoken, directly in your writing towards your father or to your father's voice? And I said, Leslie, what do you think I've been doing for the last 25 years? What do you think all of this is, if not my speaking against that voice of self-destruction? That's all I've been doing. But then it made me think about the aspect of not just talking against that voice, but also about how, I'm not crazy about the language, how I mothered myself, or better said, how I nurtured myself. How do I speak to myself? How do I give to myself? How do I create space for myself? How do I make myself safe? How do I make a refuge for my work? How do I privilege energy to go towards my own creating? And having to examine all of that and seeing all the places where I wasn't doing any of that. How can you expect to have energy to write if you're working 60 hours a week and you're sleeping 3 hours a night and you're eating peanut butter sandwiches? Like, it's you have to think about, okay, what are the basic needs here? If you don't speak kindly to yourself, if you don't say, I'm going to give myself time and energy, I'm going to privilege my writing and my creating, or even my rest and my peacefulness over all these other things, how do you expect to be able to create? And so the more that I found myself consciously thinking about the nurturing aspect and nurturing myself, then it also, I started talking about this language of the ways that we use the language of scarcity around creativity. We talk about stealing time, and not just stealing time, but so many people, and I hear this all the time, especially from women, who think that creating means that they steal time from their partners, from their children, from their career, from the neighbor down the street, from anything they're taking from other people in order to have for themselves. And I thought, well, that's an ass backwards way of looking at this. How do we change the language to say, not I'm going to steal an hour, or I'm going to take sleep away from myself, or how do I give myself an hour? How do I give myself space? How do I give myself energy? If I know, as a chronically ill person, I deal with a lot of, daily pain, that kind of issues. If I know that these things hurt, then how can I be kind to myself? How can I make myself stronger? How can I allow for the fact that I'm going to be exhausted? And so when you start to rebalance all of that, or to change the language around it, it changes the relationship to the time, and it changes the relationship to the energy. And so much is about protecting that energy. So in all of this, in that process of naming the internal enemy, and the process of figuring out how to nurture, I think, partially also the process of aging. I think it really is true. You hit 40 and something just shifts, and you're just like, I really don't care about all these other things anymore. And it gives a kind of freedom that you didn't have before. And I hear that the freedom is even better after 15, after 16, after 70. And I figure at some point, complete fearlessness just kicks in. But I do know that right now, I'm going to say dedicated writing, has probably been the last 23 years since I came to Austin. So in the dedicated period of the last 23 years, even though I am really tired and I need to sleep now and I need a bunch of other things, I feel like I am at the most fearless point that I have ever been. I feel the most at home in language than I have ever felt. And I feel, I guess the way to say it would be that I feel at the most peace with my spirits. Because I know that when I was writing my first stories, I often felt haunted or chased, perhaps plagued with these ideas and stories and visions and all of these different things. And my relationship to all that is not what it was before. It's peaceful now, but it's an energized peacefulness. And that's what's really exciting. And so, now when I come to the page, sometimes still, I sit down to write and stuff doesn't happen, or I might spend, 4 hours working on 3 sentences. That still happens all the time. And then there are other times when it just takes off. At this point in my practice of writing, it's all good. It is all good. Whether it's a sentence or whether it's a page or whether it's a story, it doesn't matter. It's all good. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've been bringing up too in the workshop I've been recently doing. And that's that we put the weight of so much expectation on everything we work on. If we manage to spend a lovely hour, well, before the pandemic, if we manage to spend a lovely hour or an afternoon at a cafe writing, and we feel so good and we're enjoying our coffee and we're enjoying being there with a page and we're enjoying being there with our thoughts, that then to look at what we write afterwards and immediately judge it and say, well, what's this I wrote? That's a disservice to the time and the life you just spent. It's a disservice to these poor, 150 words on the page, all the ways that we can show generosity to ourselves and to our work. It doesn't just save energy, it magnifies it, because you carry that that positive experience into your next experience, into your next experience, into your next experience, until all of your experiences of writing have to do with generosity and have to do with energy and have to do with peacefulness. I don't want to say live. It is live, but I want to say it's an imagination that has a potential to take action, whether in your mind or in someone else's or in the collective imagination and the collective consciousness. There are all these different ways that this imagination has energy to it. But I think it's something that we, specifically, I think, as Chicanx Latinx people, have to connect also to our indigeneity. I mean, somebody else at another panel that I was at came up to me and we started talking about how much we both love Toni Morrison and just how much we love to work and how, what a huge effect she'd had on us and everything else. And I don't know how we left from this conversation about Toni Morrison. That's what it was. So we were talking about Toni Morrison and how she wrote about not writing for the white gaze. The way that people discuss it is the ways in which you frame your story, what you explain and don't explain, what kind of language is used. That's usually what people think about when they think about white gaze. But I think it could be further extended and capture, I think, some too of our indigenous background and way of thinking, in that writing to a white gaze means assuming things about relationships. It means that we assume what the relationship is between a person and the earth, a person and nature, a person and another person, the relationship between life and death, the relationship between history and the future and our present. There are all of these assumptions about how these things are connected, what cause and effect is, what comes first, what has, what's more important than another thing, and even how nature and elements of nature relate to each other. There's all of these assumptions that put people and certain kinds of people in a certain place. Another panel that I was on a few years ago, I was reading from my Ire'ne story. And there was a Native American writer also on the panel, and then we had a moderator who kept insisting that we were writing magical realism and that we had all these fantastical elements to our stories. And both the Native American writer and I looked at her and said, "What are you talking about? We're writing our experience. This is our actual real life experience." And she was completely flabbergasted. But I was thinking about them, there is this assumption of what the relationship is between life and death, between people and memory, between the way that the dead do and don't live in our lives. So it means a lot more. This idea of not writing for the white gaze, it means a lot more than just the idea of audience. It even means what we write and how we write and what we would choose to write about.